Our live streaming. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to now we'll begin. All right. Good morning, everyone. We will welcome to the Sacramento Area Council of Governments Board of Directors meeting for Thursday, September 16th, 2021. Let's go ahead and begin with our Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll go ahead and lead us. So if you'll join me and put up the flag. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America,
The Republic
to the republic
stands
which is
one nation
under God,
indivisible, with liberty and
liberty and
justice.
justice for all.
justice for. Thank you, everyone. I will take the roll call, please, Lynette.
Thank you. Before I get started, just another reminder to please mute your devices if you're not speaking. And then if you'd like to make a comment during the meeting or you have a question, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom so that we can call on you. Director Baines,
Present.
Bernasconi,
Here.
Bradford,
Here.
Branscombe,
Here.
Boulahan,
Here.
Burris, absent Clerk Kretz,
Here.
Desmond,
Here.
Frericks,
Here.
Frost,
Here.
Gallardo,
Here.
Gog,
Here.
Guerrero,
Here.
Harris,
Here.
Joyner,
Here.
Kennedy,
Here.
Aquino for Kozlowski,
Here.
Lozano,
Here.
Middleton absent New,
Here.
Sander,
Here.
Saragosa,
Here.
Saylor,
Here.
Chenier absent Spokley,
Here.
Stallard,
Here.
Soon,
Here.
Thomas,
Here.
West, absent Vice Chair Jennings,
Here.
Chair Gore,
Here.
and ex officio member Tacker for Benny Paul.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. And just an introduction as well. We have Osman Mufti is our general counsel for today's meeting since Kirk Trost isn't here today. So we're glad you're here. Welcome. All right, as we get started, I did want to make one announcement. I wanted to thank those who volunteered to serve on the nominating committee for the 2022 chair and vice chair positions. So we've got 7 folks who have agreed to serve, and those are Director Clark Kretz, Frericks, Gallardo, Saylor, Chenier, Stallard, and I've asked Director Spokley to serve as chair. So information on how to submit nominations for 2022 leadership will be provided by an email within the next couple of days. And then as a reminder, the election of chair and vice chair will take place at our December board meeting. So more to come for those of you who have agreed to serve on the committee, and we'll have an opportunity to meet coming up. So thank you. Next is our opportunity for communication. It's the time for anyone who wishes to address the board on an item that is not elsewhere on our agenda. Lynette, did we receive any public comments via email, or is there currently a member of the public who would like to comment?
There are no public communications.
All right, then let's go ahead and move to our consent agenda, consent calendar. And these are items intended to be approved with one motion, but somebody can remove an item for separate discussion. Does any director wish to remove an item for public comment?
Through the chair. I move to approve the consent calendar.
I second that.
We have a motion by Director Baines and second by,
Martha Guerrero.
that works, Martha Guerrero. Thank you. And no public comment, Lynette. I just want to check.
No public comment.
Great. All right, then we will go ahead and take the roll call, please, on the consent calendar.
Thank you. Director Baines,
Aye.
Bernasconi, Director Bernasconi, could you indicate your vote, please?
I'm sorry, aye.
Thank you. Bradford,
Aye.
Branscombe,
Aye.
Houlihan,
Aye.
Burris, absent Clark Kretz,
Aye.
Desmond,
Aye.
Frericks,
Aye.
Frost,
Aye.
Gallardo,
Aye.
Gog,
Yes.
Guerrero,
Aye.
Harris,
Yes.
Joyner,
Yes.
Kennedy,
Aye.
Aquino for Kozlowski,
Aye.
Lozano,
Aye.
Middleton absent New,
Aye.
Sander,
Aye.
Zaragoza,
Aye.
Sailor,
Aye.
Chenier absent Spokely,
Yes.
Stallard,
Aye.
Soon,
Aye.
Thomas,
Aye.
West.
Aye.
Oh, thank you. Vice Chair Jennings,
Yes.
Chair Gore.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Thank you. Next, we are moving on to item 10, which is the Youth Leadership Academy Outreach and Recruitment. Rosie Ramos, take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Rosie Ramos here, project manager for the Youth Leadership Academy. And I'm really excited to join you this morning because we're officially kicking off our recruitment and opening our application for the 4th year of YLA. Yes, that's 4 years now. We've been doing this for 3, and we're excited to bring on this next cohort. Applications are going to open today, and they will be open until October 15th. So that's about a month, and we're hoping that we can really get your help in reaching out in your communities and letting young leaders know about this really great opportunity. In your packet, you will find a toolkit with a variety of sample language that you can use for emails, newsletters, social media. So just draft language that you can share across a variety of mediums. But if there's anything that you need that's not included, please let me know. Happy to work with you or staff to get you what you need for recruitment. There's links to the online toolkit as well that has a lot of the social media graphics that you can post across a variety of different platforms. So we really hope that you can help us get the word out. We hope to get at least one student from each jurisdiction. So as we recruit over the next month, we'll be paying close attention to each jurisdiction, each city and county. If we happen to see that there's not a lot coming from a particular area, we'll be sure to reach out to you for additional help. So if you have any questions on Toolkit, happy to take them now, or my email is in there. And like I said, if there's anything else you need, please let me know. As a reminder, the Youth Leadership Academy is a partnership with Pro Youth and Families, and it's a program for 9th and 12th graders through 12th graders to get introduced to the work that SACOG is doing, to get involved with transportation and land use planning, local and regional government, civic engagement, and really tap into the relationships that are critical for our region to create thriving communities, right? So that they can see the partnerships that are needed with SACOG and all the jurisdictions across our region to have a healthy region. It's also a way for students to sharpen their leadership and strategic thinking skills with the hopes that we're creating pathways for them to become civically engaged in the future. And hopefully, you know, they go into careers in the public sector or come and take a seat at this table in the future as well. So I'm going to pause there before I go into the logistics. If there's any questions on the overall program or about the recruitment today.
Any questions from directors about the program? And I see that Director Guerrero has raised her hand.
Thank you. Quick question about outreach. This is my first time. Are there any recommendations? I was thinking of sending it to our superintendent and our social media, from the city. Any other recommendations anybody has to successfully recruit people from your jurisdiction?
I think is this to other board members?
I've sent it to high school government teachers.
Okay, good idea.
That's helpful as well. I don't know if others have had other groups they've targeted.
We had a spark plug at one high school who really turned out people. And it needs to get below the superintendent level to be effective.
Yeah, sometimes those don't get passed on, but if you can find a teacher or a staff member who is super supportive, that's helpful.
Great idea. Thank you.
I would also suggest going straight to, if you have a youth commission, go to them and they can get it out to their network. And as well as most districts have a youth advisory council, getting it to them. They're the leaders on all their campuses and they'll get it out. Peer-to-peer is the best way to do it, I've found.
Thank you, Director.
I've also had success reaching out to principals directly, so just below the superintendent.
Thank you.
And as the wife of a high school principal for too long, I'll tell you, send it to the counseling office.
Great idea.
They'll actually get it and they'll know the students that might be interested.
All right, lots of great suggestions. So Rosie, you can keep those in mind for the future.
Yes.
You encourage us again next year.
Yes, definitely. Just for reference, we, Pro Youth and Families and SACOG staff will do a lot of direct outreach to teachers individually. We definitely are going to target those Title I schools in our environmental justice areas as well. So I think coupled with all of your strategies, I think we are headed to, getting a lot of great responses. Last year, we got over 120, so hoping to hit around the same numbers this year. Again, so for some of the logistics, we plan to create a hybrid program for next year with one session a month being on Zoom, one in person. So really looking forward to getting to field trips and highlighting our really amazing region again. Of course, we'll be paying close attention to safety protocols. I also invite you to start thinking about joining us as guest speakers in the year to come. Students really enjoy the opportunity to connect with you. And I think it's a really unique opportunity that they don't get in other places. So if that's of interest, let me know so that we can start planning it into the program early on. So again, the recruitment applications will open today. It will go through October 15th. We'll have a final cohort selected by early November. We plan to have an orientation in December, kick off the program in January, and then conclude in June of 2022. So I will stop there. Again, if there's any other questions, happy to take them, but my email is in there and we can provide any other toolkit materials or guidance that you might need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Appreciate it. Any other questions? Director Harris.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosie. And forgive me, everybody, I had to step out and take a call, so I came in on the tail end of this conversation. Was there a question asked? It sounded like, based on some of the information, that ideas for recruiting participants in the I might throw out, I'm a foster parent, and some of these foster agencies, they have these children that are just amazing, that some of the stuff that they've come through, their backgrounds, the adversity they've encountered, but yet they're still, rising stars as far as academics and their attitude. That might be another place to look for participants. Also, you mentioned a guest speaker in the program. I had the honor of being asked to do that, and I did so, and it was a wonderful thing. So I would like to do it again. I encourage anybody who hasn't given a shot yet to do the same. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Harris. And I did have an opportunity to watch some of the presentations at the end of this last session, and the students they do a terrific job. So get the word out. Thank you, Rosie, for the work that you're doing in this program. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we're going to move to item 11, and it is our Race, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group meeting summary. Vice Chair Jennings is the chair of that group, and so he's going to report out on the meeting that we had, I think, last month, and he will also introduce our the workshop speaker after that. So Vice Chair Jennings.
Thank you, Chair Gore, and thank you for this opportunity to present today. If I could take a little personal privilege, I just want to stop for a second and say, how about those Raiders? Right? Many times when I played, you end up sweating through the whole game. And I felt like I played in that game and helped them win because I was sweating at the end. So if you're a Raider fan, you understand what I'm talking about. That was a great victory. So anyway, personal privilege is taken. And I want to now move to the main agenda, which is the summary of the Race, Equity, and Inclusion, our second meeting of the year, and want to talk about that. I don't feel like I'm an expert in this particular field. I feel like I'm knowledgeable. I feel like I'm living it. But at the same time, I'm learning every single day. And so I thank you for the opportunity to be the chair of this group and look forward to meeting with them. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the Race, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group, the group that we have that's working together. I'm going to talk to you about the 3 primary outcomes. I'm going to give you a quick meeting summary of what we talked about. And then I'm going to introduce to you a gentleman that just wooed the working group, Mr. Charles Brown. I'm going to introduce him, and he's going to take up most of the time that we have. He's number 12 on our agenda today. We have a workshop on race inequity in transportation. So I really want to give him as much time as possible. So we met for the second time this year. It's been 3 months since our last report. And so we wanted to the full board. So we wanted to kind of recap what the working group membership is all about. And I think staff has a slide that I'd like them to put up while I talk, if they will. Our staff, our working group consists of 10 SACOG board members and also 10 members of the public. If you'll just kind of give a thumbs up or just a little round of applause to our external working group members as well as our SACOG members for serving on this committee. And I just want to say to you right now, one of the things that this committee wants to do is they want to move the agenda at a faster pace. They ask for more meetings. Now, I know how busy everybody is, everybody that's here in this meeting and them as well, but they ask for more meetings because they want to move the pace. And I'm extremely excited about that. So you can see who our working group members are. And I know many of you know some of the members of the working group, but I would like to thank them for stepping up, for their willingness to serve and their desire to affect meaningful change. So you can take that down now. I think most of us have seen that. I just want to kind of focus on the 3 primary outcomes of the working group. One is to develop a racial equity statement of change and commitment. And this statement will set a high level of direction of the ongoing racial inequity efforts at SACOG and serve as a guidepost to the board, the staff, and the member agencies. Number 2, prioritize racial equity in the upcoming MTP SCS long-range plan. And staff will be working over the year to have a racial equity as a consistent, reportable, and transparent approach in our next MTP SCS, our region's long-range transportation plan. I think all of you know that the MTP and SCS sets the vision and priorities for transportation investment and growth for the region. And if our region is to be one where race isn't the predictor of life's outcomes, this is a critical action as we move forward. Number 3 is to build the support and direction for developing a racial equity action plan in 2022. Building on our work from last year, we're moving forward to developing a racial equity action plan in 2022. And the SACOG staff are working thoughtfully and part of a measured approach in ensuring that we are including more people of color in this process. We are building the right foundation for SACOG's racial equity action plan. Our meeting summary. You all have the meeting summary in your board packages, so I'm not going to go through it in detail because hopefully you've had the opportunity to read it, but I just want to share a few observations from it. In our second meeting, since it was our second meeting, we continued to build on building relationships within the group and building a common understanding of racial inequity in the transportation planning. I kicked off the meeting reminding the group of the why for this meeting. First, expressing and acknowledging that government at every level has played a role in suppressing equal opportunity to people of color since colonization. And second, that SACOG is committed to working to undo past harms that still plague our nation today and making future policy and program decisions that will work towards racially just and equitable outcomes. I think we all know that this is a hard task and it may take a long time, but we have a shared sense of urgency and commitment that I believe will sustain our efforts. With this all teed up, we dove into the main event of our evening, of our meeting, a presentation from Mr. Charles Brown. And he did such an incredible job that we wanted to make sure you heard him as well. So that's going to be our workshop today. So Mr. Brown from Equitable Cities has a history of racial inequity in transportation planning. He provided a comprehensive and data-based presentation on the importance of centering racial equity in transportation planning, policy, implementation, and research, that we wanted to give him the opportunity to come before the full board, which will happen today. We're about to hear from him in today's workshop. And his presentation was so provoking and so thoughtful that we ran over time and no one complained at all. They were all fine with the fact that we ran over time and they wanted more of his time, which we're going to make sure that they get. In our discussion, Mr. Brown provided this answer to a response of a question. Any system that is not diverse is inherently biased. I assigned the working group homework for each person to reflect on their lived experiences and think about whether or not they can relate to, agree with, or disagree with that statement. I do the same for you, because I'm sure you'll hear that statement again from him today. I made a decision with staff to push the third topic of the racial equity meeting to our next November meeting because I wanted to make sure we gave Mr. Brown as much time as possible. I'm hoping we have the same system today. I also invited the group to join me in reading The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGhee. I'm going to challenge you as well to join us in that challenge of reading that book. And I'm hopeful that we can have the opportunity to sit down and talk about that book in detail and discuss the merits and the broad depth of that book. Next steps for the group is to work on a racial equity statement that will come to the full board for discussion and adoption, and working with staff to support a focus on equity in the next MTP SCS and a framework for racial equity action plan. That's a summary of our meeting. And with that, now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today for this workshop, item number 12, Mr. Charles Brown. So I'm gonna give you the short bio. He's the founder and principal of Equitable Cities, a minority and veteran-owned urban planning, public policy, and research firm focused at the intersection of transportation, health, and equity. He's also an adjunct professor at the Edwin J. Bluestein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. Charles is an award-winning expert in planning and policy and has been interviewed by several notable outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, Vice, and Bloomberg City Labs, just to name a few. He's highly regarded as a keynote speaker and leads workshops on transportation, health, and equity for audiences worldwide. Charles previously served as a senior researcher with the Allen M. Voorhees Transportation Center at Rutgers University, where he authored several groundbreaking national and local studies that redefine how experts analyze the role of race and racism in transportation and mobility. In 2020, Charles was part of an inaugural class of the Public Voices Fellowship on Climate Crisis, which is managed by the Yale School of the Environment. Charles is a military veteran and a recipient of the Mississippi Commendation Medal and Global War on Terrorism Service Medal. He has a Master's of Public Administration degree and a graduate certificate in urban and regional planning from the University of Central Florida, where he received the 2020 Alumni Achievement Award for Public Administration. He also has a Bachelor of Science in Management degree from Belhaven College, where he received the James W. Park Academic Achievement Award. He's a certified instructor with the League of American Bicyclists, received a Crime Prevention Thought Environmental Design Professional Designation from the National Institute of Crime Prevention. He is also a proud and active member of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to present to you a man that's going to leave you thinking and make you move forward in thought for many years to come. Let me introduce to some and present to others, Mr. Charles Brown.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Committee Chair Jennings. I certainly need to take you on the road with me. Thank you for that very warm introduction. Good morning to you all. Good afternoon from me. I'm on the East Coast. Again, my name is Charles T. Brown. I want to talk to you today about mobility for all, the importance of centering racial equity in transportation planning, policy, and research. I would like to start with this picture of me first to embarrass myself so I can get that out of the way very early, but most importantly, to reintroduce myself as all that you've heard, but more importantly, as a street level researcher, as well as a pracademic. This is because I've spent many years inside and outside of academia, and I strongly believe that as a street level researcher, many of the answers to our questions are found in the streets among the people. I was reared in rural Mississippi in a town of less than 500 people. But since that time, I've traveled and worked in communities of all sizes, ideologies, and cultures across North America. Some identify politically as blue, some red, some green, but many confused.
1 p.m.
I live by the African proverb, I am because we are. To kick this presentation off, I think it's imperative that we start with a definition of equity and racial equity. Equity is the guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. This principle of equity acknowledges that there are historically underserved and underrepresented populations, and that fairness regarding these unbalanced conditions is needed to assist equality in the provision of effective opportunities to all groups. The principles of equity state that it involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full and healthy lives. However, we must be reminded, though, that equity is the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and the distribution of resources by institutions or systems. It is not, though, just a desktop exercise. When doing this equity work, it requires an understanding of the underlying or root causes of inequality and oppression within our society. So what is racial equity? Racial equity work is about transforming the behaviors, the institutions, and systems that disproportionately harm people of color. As we heard from Chair Jennings there, government at all levels has, to some degree, disproportionately harmed people of color. Racial equity, though, is also about increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color and others to thrive and reach their full potential. Lastly, encouraging racial equity is not about excluding other marginalized groups. And because of the conversation I expect following this, I want to reemphasize that it is not about excluding other marginalized groups. There are various equity dimensions. Too often, we only focus on a few of those: the ability, the income, the modal, and the race and ethnicity. There's gender equity, there's process and payment equity, there's spatial equity, there's environmental equity, etc. But we can't just stop at equity or racial equity. It's important then that we understand intersectionality. And when you understand intersectionality, you quickly understand the importance of a consideration of social identities. You begin to ask yourself a series of questions such as, which identities do you think about most often? Which identities do you think about least often? Which of your own identities would you like to learn more about? And which of your identities have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself? And which of your identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? Why is this important? This is important because oftentimes it is the identities that we think about least often that all too often are left from our tables, cut out of our decision-making process, or whose pain and trauma we normalize for the sake of the greater good. See, this is about the seen and the unseen. And to illustrate the importance of both the seen and the unseen, I invite you into my graduate studio class, where on the first day, I have them take a look at this photograph and I have them answer the question, how would you transform this environment? And just like you, many of them are thinking about the sidewalk, the trash, the need for trees and more greenery, the need for benches, pedestrian scale lighting. What about bicycle lanes? What about a center median, etc.? Well, this is the West Ward of Newark, New Jersey, a historically minority community. They too wanted everything that you envision in this photo, and that included the bicycle lane. The problem isn't with the infrastructure. The problem is that too often with the infrastructure comes the removal of people from their environment. So are they concerned about gentrification? Yes, but they were more concerned with the fact that planners and engineers throughout this country do before and after renderings such as these and erase Black and brown people out of the future. So they're not fighting against the bike lane. They're fighting against the possibility of not being present when the bike lane arrives. Because they know, quite candidly, that transportation in many ways, as well as planning, has been weaponized as a tool of oppression within society. If you want to look for evidence of that oppression, you can look to the highway robberies that have taken place across this country. Anywhere that there's an interstate highway, there's a Black, or brown, or low-income community that has been devastated through a transportation decision. And that's not just a national thing, that's also a regional one, such as in the ACOG region. Whether we're talking I-80, I-5, State Highways 160, 99, and others throughout your region. We also know that there's a strong connection to climate change or the importance of climate justice. I know firsthand because I was fortunate and unfortunate to have experienced Hurricane Katrina while living in Mississippi and Hurricane Sandy while in New Jersey. But we also know there is traffic violence that results from these decisions or indecisions as it relates to minority communities. As a result, those most at risk include older adults, people of color, and people walking in low-income communities. When it comes to older adults, their relative pedestrian danger for those aged 50 and older is more than a third higher than the general population. People of color, particularly Black Americans, were 72% more likely to have been struck and killed by drivers while walking. And then lastly, and this is another reason why we all should care, people living in neighborhoods where the median household income is $36,000 or less were killed at a much higher rate than their counterparts. And guess what the response was? It's all behavioral. It's about the choices we make. This is what engineers and planners throughout this country are saying, is behavioral. I'm here to challenge that. See, it's not just behavior. Quite frankly, one's race determines one's place, which determines one's health within the context of America. And to illustrate this point, I bring you back to your region. I know Sacramento, the city here, is the focal point, but just play along with me for a second. If blue represents where the majority of our white brothers and sisters live, green represents for where our Black and African-American brothers and sisters live. Purple, Hispanic, peach is Asian. What do you see? It's not enough to just focus on your region, because if I focus just on your region, that is what you call episodic framing. I want to show you a theme. I want to make this thematic. Let's go to Detroit. You see here in Detroit, that blue represents where white people live, green, black, purple, Hispanic. What do you see in Detroit? Well, let's not stop there. Let's go to Houston, Texas, one of the largest metropolitan areas and cities in all of America. If blue represents where white live, green represents where black live, what do you see in Houston? It's not enough to stop at Houston. We have to go to the city that in many ways determined the presidential election, Atlanta. If blue determines where white live, green, black, what do you see? You may not believe that this is thematic. You may still think that it is episodic. So we need to go to Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, to make the point. But perhaps that doesn't do it. What if we go to the most progressive city, quote unquote, in America, New York City? You see the same thing. You see racial, residential segregation. I believe, though, that some of you may not see that it is by design. So to make that point, let's go to Oregon, in particular, Portland, Oregon. If blue represents where white people live for the most part, in Portland, green, black, purple, Hispanic, Asian, peach, what do you see in Portland or in Oregon? For the most part, you see a decision to deny access. Because when you know the history of Oregon, you know for a very long time, Black people and other people of color were not allowed. So then what do we find? We find then that history doesn't say goodbye. History, in fact, says see you later. I showed you information from Smart Growth America that was in 2017. Guess what? Nothing has changed. In fact, older adults are still disproportionately being killed. Black and Native Americans are still disproportionately more likely to die. California remains in the top 20 of the most dangerous states. And the question then is asked, what are we doing at a regional level to address these issues? We know who is dying and we know where they're dying. Why isn't the money following the greatest place of need? That's unfortunate because, again, you're ranked in the top 16 as a state for being the most dangerous states for pedestrians in the nation. Go Raiders. I'm a huge fan of Raiders, but when we're ranked high for something, we don't want it to be for being the most dangerous. So how can we, yes, the collective we, create a safe, equitable, and inclusive system for all? We have to challenge this notion of behavior. See, in the public health realm, they're starting to get it. Because for too often in transportation and in health, we've started at risk behaviors. We've said if you have low physical activity, violence, smoking, et cetera, it's going to lead to disease and injury, which leads to mortality. Thankfully, others have made the connection that we always knew was true. It's not just risk, behavior, disease, and injury and mortality. See, there's a connection between risk and living conditions. There's a connection between institutional inequities and living conditions. And there's also a connection between social inequities and institutional inequities. So instead of saying it's behavioral, we have to look at the fact that there are social inequities that have a bidirectional relationship to institutional inequities that influence the living conditions and the realities on the street, which lead to the behavior, the disease and injury, and the mortality. So if you run across someone and they say the environment made me do it, they may be telling you the truth. So how do we move past this? We need a justice framework. We need to understand the inherent connections or differences between inequality, equality, equity, and justice. See, outside of a legal construct of crime and punishment, justice involves removing the barriers that prevent equality and equity. This first image shows you equality, inequality. One person has access to the apples falling from the tree and one person does not. The second represents equality. While both people are given ladders of equal height, the tree leans to the left, making the apples accessible for one person, but not the other. The third image represents equity. The person on the right side of the tree is given a taller ladder to access the apples, while the person on the left has shorter access, or a shorter ladder for access. Finally, there is justice. In this, we see that the tree is straightened, thus removing the barrier for the person on the right. He no longer needs a taller ladder to access the apples. This justice framework can be summed up in a number of ways. I want you to focus on 4 or 5 forms of justice. 1 is distributive justice, 2 is procedural justice, 3 or 4 is interactional and representational justice, and then lastly, care. Yes, care is still important in the work that we do. But what is distributive justice? Distributive justice focuses on who has access or physical access to that street, that park, or that trail. Because my research has shown me that when it comes to safe routes to school programs, et cetera, most respondents do not feel that their children are safe from traffic when bicycling in their neighborhoods. So yes, you can build it, but until the parents feel that their children are safe, nothing will not be done. We also know that even though Black and brown people live proximate to local parks and trails, nearly 1 in 4 feel that they can safely bicycle to it. What that speaks to is that proximity isn't access. There is a social political atmosphere, such as the ways in which we treat each other and enforcement, that we must take into consideration when we think about what is access. This takes us to the need for greater procedural justice. Look around the room. Who has influence over the design, the operations, and the program? This is imperative because minority youth, historically as well as in contemporary times, are usually not included in planning and transportation decision-making processes. This is unfortunate considering that them and their parents are disproportionately more likely to be victims of traffic violence, which takes us to interactional justice. What makes people feel welcomed or unwanted in this space? This is imperative because African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. Yet and still, we have Vision Zero efforts around this country that still have not removed or reconceptualized the importance of enforcement in safety. When it comes to the intersectional piece, males reported being stopped at a rate 7 times that of females. And then we find that the fatal violence against transgender and gender nonconforming community goes unreported or misreported in transportation and mobility discussions. They act as if we're all the same, see the differences in us, and create a system that addresses the needs based on those differences, which takes us to representational justice. Do people feel their experience and history is represented in the space? We don't have to look far within the state of California or within the St. Cobb region to know how often historical and cultural erasure takes place, which takes us then into leadership on the board and elsewhere. See, this is about care. This is how you demonstrate your care, not only for the space, but also for people in it. Because when we're being honest, we know as men that our systems have been biased against those identifying as women and does not protect to the degree it needs to religious minority groups. So what needs to happen internally? There needs to be a reframing, an adoption of anti-racist values in a culture, a racial equity action plan, trainings, performance measures, and then to hold you accountable both internal and external equity advisory groups. See, this is about institutionalizing racial equity within the culture at SACOG. And an equity culture is one that is focused on proactively, not reactively to shootings such as George Floyd, et cetera, but proactively counteracting inequities inside as well as outside your organization. And why do I think this is possible? Because Utah has done it. And if Utah can do it, certainly my beautiful people of California can do it. And I love you too, Utah, you know that. But this gets even deeper. I wanted to give you a history because there's something that's happening perhaps before your eyes that's not getting the attention that it needs to get. And that is when it comes to Black, Indigenous people of color, Black and Indigenous people of color, their mobility has been arrested. And you may ask, how has their mobility been arrested? Well, there's a plethora of federal, state, and local initiatives, plans, policies, and programs aimed at increasing physical activity and improving pedestrian and bicycle safety and mobility among Black and brown people in the US. I've mentioned Vision Zero. There's complete streets, open streets, livable streets, and safe streets. However, when we're being honest, few of them actually ever achieve their goal of removing barriers to Black and brown people being more physically active. So what are some challenges or the opportunities? Well, the current descriptions are usually ahistorical and apolitical, particularly in regard to the history of structural racism within the US. Secondly, they do not highlight to the degree that they should the role of state and municipal law enforcement in discouraging and denying physical activity among BIPOC populations. Thirdly, equitable and inclusive access is listed as a foundational element in many cases, but not explicitly as a desired outcome or goal with a tangible organizational commitment to funding organizations that work with and in these communities. Going back to my third principle, this is too about the process, the procedure, and the distribution of resources. Fourth, there is no mention of the overwhelming data highlighting the magnitude of unconscious bias and the criminalization of Blackness in America. Fifth, these strategies do not discuss the need for institutional changes, particularly around increasing DEI, both internally and externally. What we've done is we've simply said these are social determinants of health within a planning context. We know, quite frankly, that these are political determinants of health. So you may ask, what then is arrested mobility? Arrested mobility is the assertion that Black people and other minorities have been historically and presently denied by both legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space. If you're following the stats, this results in adverse social, political, economic, environmental, and health effects that are widespread and preventable. Unfortunately, because they have not been prevented, they become intergenerational. So what's the framework of arrested mobility? As shown here, it is the direct manifestation of racism across 4 distinct realms of racism. In short, we'll call it structural racism. But those 4 realms are personal, interpersonal, institutional, and given the diversity of California, do not forget cultural. These collective realms of racism have resulted in the social construct of race locally and globally, and have led to the intentional and deliberate targeting and over-policing of Black and brown people. This includes directly their physical mobility, and indirectly their social or upward mobility. And for my fellow social scientists, please understand that I understand the direct relationship between the variables shown here are much more complex and nuanced. So how are they over-policed? Well, over-policing is evident, or policing has been radically reimagined by me and redefined to focus on 3 Ps, the aggregate of P as in Paul. The first P is policy. When you think about zoning or racialized zoning, racial residential segregation, and then also investment or disinvestment decisions. Then there's policing or law enforcement at the federal, the state, and the local level. And then lastly, there's polity, which includes the deputization of white citizens, the quote unquote Karens throughout the country. And so when you look at arrested mobility, in the context of physical mobility, these various degrees of over-policing are evident and supported by data across all the different modalities. Whether you're walking, biking, driving, taking public or private transit, hopping a ride via rideshare, or using a micromobility device such as an e-scooter. And this is true. It happens even regardless of age. You can be a 3-year-old, such as my son here, riding your bicycle, or you can be such as this young boy or girl here riding the neck of your father. This is imperative because understanding how over-policing arrests the physical mobility of Black and brown people allows us the ability to ensure that safety and access is not denied. So is there evidence to support this claim of arrested mobility across the different modes of transportation? Let's start with walking. The most recent and notable cases of over-policing Black mobility via walking or running in the US includes the shooting deaths and murder of Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging, Trayvon Martin, who was walking, and Mike Brown, who was also walking. Both Ahmaud and Trayvon were murdered by self-deputized non-Black citizens, and Mike Brown was killed by law enforcement. But what does the data say? The data shows in an analysis of 5 years of tickets issued to pedestrians in Jacksonville, Florida, it revealed that 55% of the tickets were issued to Black individuals, even though they make up only 29% of the population. In that same study, they found that Blacks were 3 times more likely to receive a ticket than whites. And the residents of the city's 3 poorest zip codes were about 6 times as likely to receive a pedestrian citation. If you have not heard of her, Raquel Nelson, do yourselves a favor right now and Google Raquel Nelson. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended at walking and running. Unfortunately, it does not. And this takes me to the Bay in California, where one of the more recent cases included the murder of Oscar Grant III, who was a 22-year-old Black man murdered by a BART police officer in Oakland. But to not make this episodic but to make it instead thematic, let's look again at the data. What does the data say in New York City? Well, a Marshall analysis of the New York Division of Criminal Justice data from 2014 showed that 89% of those who are arrested are Black and Hispanic. The top 10 neighborhoods with the highest number of arrests per subway swipe were all predominantly Black or Hispanic. Adrian Napier was aimed at by 10 police officers for fare evasion. That fare was only $2.75. In 2017, Blacks were 8 times more likely than whites to be charged for certain transit violations in Portland. You know how alarming this is, given the picture I've painted of Oregon, and the fact that you're very less likely to see that many Black people in Portland, except for East Portland, that is. Thankfully, this was later decriminalized in 2018, which is something that needs to be done throughout this country. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended at walking, jogging, and public transit. Unfortunately, it does not. It also includes the case of Philando Castile, who was driving, and Sandra Bland, where Philando Castile was a passenger, but in an automobile. So what does the data say? A nationwide quantitative analysis of police trends in traffic stops showed that Black and Hispanic drivers are stopped disproportionately to white drivers. They also found, unsurprisingly, that police were less likely to pull over Black drivers at the dusk when the race of the driver is less obvious. This takes us to Minnesota or Minneapolis, which has been sort of like the epicenter of these racial conversations regarding enforcement. A state commission study in Minnesota found that Blacks and Latinos were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police in white majority neighborhoods. And in 2016, 47% of the arrests by a local police department in Minnesota were Black individuals, even though the patrolled area is only 7% Black. I wish it stopped at driving. Unfortunately, it does not. It also includes ride sharing. And researchers from Stanford, MIT, and the University of Washington, they found that rideshare drivers discriminate based on race and gender. Again, noting the importance of intersectionality within this conversation. And so what does the data on ride sharing show? Well, it shows that Black travelers wait on average 20% longer than their white counterparts. and female travelers were driven 5% further than males given the same start and finish location. This last point, I've experienced this whether I'm in a hoodie or a suit. 55% of Blacks who've called for a cab at some point have experienced a refusal to send a cab to, have experienced a refusal by the service to send a cab to their community. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended there. Unfortunately, it does not. We find our mobility arrested and our lives taken even while sleeping or while being a kid and playing out in our yards and streets, as in the case of Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice. But it doesn't end there. It also is present within the bicycling community, of which to many is the sexiest of the modes. Thankfully, I've been involved and written a number of studies and reports on arrest or over policing people while biking, but some of the most recent and notable studies include the one by Chicago Tribune, which was biking while Black, or studies out of Tampa and Oakland, and the more recent one done by Bicycling Magazine. But what does the data show? Well, between 2003 and 2015, Tampa police issued over 10,000 bicycle tickets. 79% of them went to Blacks, even though only 26% of the population identifies as Black. And if by chance anyone thinks that's due to behavior, we need to chat about it. Now I take you back to Oakland. But before going to Oakland, I want to point out that during this 12-year study period, at least 142 bicycle tickets were issued to kids aged 15 and under, including children as young as 3 years old. Now back to Oakland. In Oakland, we found that 60% of all bicycle stops included Black cyclists. Only 25% of that population identifies as Black. Twice as many tickets are written in majority Black neighborhoods in Chicago than in majority white or Latino neighborhoods. In fact, 321 tickets were issued in a low majority Black community in Chicago, whereas only 5 were issued in a wealthy majority white. Why is that alarming? Because if you've gone to Chicago, you know you're much more likely to see a white cyclist than any other cyclist. So to wrap up, what then are the adverse social, political, economic, and health outcomes? We know that Blacks are less likely to be physically active, regardless of neighborhood or income level, regardless of racial composition of the neighborhood. We also know, as I do daily, Black men attempt to make themselves seem less threatening. We know there's an economic connection as areas with larger Black populations tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. We know there's a health component because racial residential segregation has led to a dearth of hospitals and healthcare providers in majority Black and Hispanic areas. Lastly, we know it's disproportionately associated with food deserts, which are made even worse by a lack of access to transportation options. And then there are political consequences, as transportation disadvantage makes Black people more vulnerable to disenfranchisement efforts like a lower density of polling places, which then exacerbates the lack of representation in government. And many may ask, why or to what degree did mail-in ballots play? Think about it in that context. So many of you who are doing this outstanding work, who have the care, who have the justice framework, some of you would say, we get it, we're in the same boat. No, we're not in the same boat. It's important you realize we're in the same storm, and there's a huge difference. See, when I go out and have to talk to people, particularly Black people, about these issues, I find out how tired they are. They're so tired that they can't go jogging, they can't ask for help after being in a car crash, they can't walk from the corner store, they can't get a normal traffic ticket, they can't have a disabled vehicle, they can't run, they can't breathe, they can't live. They feel, as I feel, their mobility has been arrested. And that's regardless as to if there's proper infrastructure or not, whether they're in a wheelchair or bicycling, their mobility has been arrested. Thank you for the time here to share this with you today. I look forward to the questions that you may ask. And I want to preface this by saying, feel free to ask any question you would like to ask. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brown. Really appreciate it. You've given us lots to think, so I would anticipate there may be some questions. So if there are questions, if you would go ahead and raise your virtual hand. And give you a moment to think about it a little bit. Director Frost.
Hi, Mr. Brown. I want to thank you for that presentation. It's a little bit heartbreaking. And I wanted to ask you, because in the context of this discussion, we're talking about policy. And I wonder what your thoughts are regarding, spirituality and community and other dynamics. I know, in the context of, how infrastructure or creating situations where, you have a lower cost, based on design, and that can, make a difference in quality of life for the community in that area. And I think it's true that there are prejudices. In my district, we have the Sikh community. We had a gentleman walking down the street and someone just attacked him and beat him up because he had a turban, and they didn't even know who he was or know him. They just judged him based on the way he was dressed. And so what are your thoughts around community and community development and economic development, whereby, when you're getting the community together, we are the most diverse region in the nation. And so what we lack is that we live together but apart. So I would think in integrating and understanding our cultural differences could help in this way. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were around that.
I'm in agreement with, if the question is about integration, because I know right now you're certainly diverse, but still segregated. I think the policy response there is greater integration among race, class, and religious identities. Unfortunately, they attacked that gentleman because they saw something of which they probably had no cultural connection and understanding to. So it bred fear in them, unfortunately, out of ignorance. And so how do we remove that ignorance? We remove it by giving people greater access to the varieties of cultures that are present within your region. We have to understand, when we don't work to systemically undo these injustices, we perpetuate the dominant culture. And when we're honest about what the dominant culture is in America, we know the dominant culture is white culture. And the dominance of white culture in this country has breeded, unfortunately, those of whom are white nationalists and white supremacists, who believe that anything that is not of that cloth must be dealt with accordingly. We, those meaning who are allies, who are white and others, we have a moral and a professional obligation to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of everyone on our streets. So what that demands from a regional government is that we understand the importance of enforcement, not for just traffic reasons, but also personal safety reasons. It also demands a greater accountability of those of whom we call for enforcement, which is police officers. So the policy response is greater integration. Why? Because it has shown to lead to greater social and upward mobility for racialized minority groups in this country.
How do you identify white nationalists and I didn't remember what you said.
White supremacists,
Yeah, how do you know who they are?
they tell us who they are
Oh, okay.
by their actions, by their creeds, and about their formation. The FBI has a list of white nationalists in this country. And some recent research, I'm working in the city of Berkeley right now, just to give you some stats here really quickly. But there are the number of victims of hate crimes against Blacks or African Americans in the US in 2019, based on the by stats by the FBI, the number one thing was intimidation. And that's one form of hate crime. And guess where a lot of it is happening? It's happening on our sidewalks, our roadways, and our highways, because in 2019, there were 814 incidents of race-based hate crimes on American roadways. And so we have an obligation to understand that transportation doesn't have a way out of this, because it's taking place on the very streets of which we have control over.
Thank you. Director Thomas, please.
Yes, I just want to say, I want to thank you for your presentation, Charles. You provided so much rich food for thought and some linkages and connections that I had never made before, especially in thinking about inequities in terms of transportation. And I think this is a really important message for local governments across our nation and policymakers to begin to build an awareness of this, that as we are faced with the decisions, hopefully it will continue to resonate with us and help inform our path forward. But just a really powerful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I like your background photo too.
Director Soon.
Thank you, Chair Gore. Dr. Brown, thank you very much for your presentation. As others have said, it was very informative. I wanted to ask about, I really appreciated the equity diagram. And, I think, well, everybody here on this board, but there's many people, as you articulated earlier, that I think are have the right heart and would like to endeavor to make things just and equitable. What would be your recommendations as far as how to go about that, making that to a place where we only need equal ladders, right, and a straight tree? We have federally, we have that $3.5 trillion justice that reconciliation package that's being talked about, but locally, what can we do here?
Yes, what we could do is, I would like to see on a regional and a state level a reparation style infrastructure package in Black and Brown and low income communities. In that package, it will include investments in bicycle infrastructure. My bias is towards protected bicycle infrastructure, that is on street or in street, as well as off street or paths as well. Investments in pedestrian infrastructure to include or to take into consideration both daytime as well as nighttime travel. It would also include investments in public transit because a large percentage of low income, particularly people of color, rely heavily on public transit. I would love to see as well investments in public art, which celebrate the various cultures that are present within your region. And I guess the overall policy recommendation is that moving forward, considering that for X number of years, a disproportionate share of the resources have gone to some of your wealthier, wider communities, that you now give them to the areas that deserve or need them most, which are some of your lower income, racialized minority groups and communities. So I think that's the response that is needed at a regional level. race does matter in this calculation or in that formula. There's no doubt about it. So I would like for race to matter in the ways in which you distribute your resources. That's what it means to be equity first.
Thank you. And Director Frericks and then Director Guerrero.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair. Dr. Brown, thanks so much for your presentation again today. I was fortunate enough to participate in the group a couple of weeks ago and that discussion. And one of the items that you touched on in that presentation that you didn't really touch on today was CPTED, crime prevention, through environmental design. And if you, that's a sort of set of policies that we in the city that I live in, City of Davis, University Town, our police department and police chief are very strong believers in, that we do a lot of work with using CPTED principles. I think it would be really helpful if you are willing to do that, a little bit of a discussion or just a touch on what CPTED is I think there may be other jurisdictions in our region that are using the similar CPTED principles, but I think it's very compelling way to go about looking at some of these issues. And so I would really appreciate your thoughts there. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so I am a crime prevention through environmental design. I have a professional designation in it. I think it was stated I'm ex-military. So what CPTED, here's why CPTED is important, crime prevention through environmental design. First, before talking about why it's important, I think I must address the elephant in the room as it relates to CPTED. That is, in many Black and Brown and low-income communities, they feel that CPTED is being used to control and restrict the access and movement of Black and Brown people. I think that has some truth, but that's much more so due to those who use CPTED as opposed to the principle and the values of CPTED. So I am a component of CPTED so long as it too centers a racial history and understanding, and the importance also of racial equity. So what is CPTED? CPTED is used to create a safe and secure environment that encourages activity, vitality, and visibility or viability, and thus enabling like a greater level of security. In first generation CPTED, there are four main principles of it. The first one is natural surveillance, which means you could see people, et cetera. There is access control, meaning you know the entry and the exit points as it relates to buildings, et cetera. There's the territorial reinforcement. This is where it gets pushed back because it's like the hardening of a space, such as walls, fences, et cetera. And then there's this space management or image management, meaning removing undesirable buildings, such as abandoned buildings, graffiti, et cetera. And so there are also second and third generation CPTED, which I won't get into here today. The main point of CPTED is to ensure that as you're designing your spaces, that they help to prevent crime as opposed to serving as a conduit for crime. The main point also is that design isn't neutral. There are racial aspects of design, and there are safety aspects of design that must be taken into consideration. And so CPTED done correctly can help lead you to that. And I'll stop there just for the sake of time. That's a whole other workshop.
Thank you. Director Guerrero.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Brown, once again for presenting to the SACOG board meeting. I have to say that there are so many layers of information that you delivered to us today. And I really appreciate the arrested mobility concept. It helps to really understand on so many levels in one snapshot the impact of our policies over the years historically. And I just think it's going to take many years to undo. And, I'm just, how do we maintain the momentum to maintain that progress? Some of these things aren't going to happen overnight. There's going to be resistance among our leadership to overturn some of those decisions that have happened in the past. It's a mindset, it's a culture, it's integrated in who we are. I strongly believe there'll be resistance, even amongst ourselves here. And I would like your advice and your guidance on a long-term plan to prevent us from remaining stagnant and remaining passionate to move forward and to be driven to make these changes. Just seeking your advice on that.
Thank you for that question. I'll give you a short-term plan instead of a long-term one. The short-term one is time to remove anyone in office that doesn't see the importance of undoing these injustices and inequities right now. This has been a long-term plan. It has been 300 or 400 plus years of disenfranchisement, oppression, et cetera, of populations who never deserved the treatment to begin with. We don't have the patience for it to take another 400 years. We need to understand how dire a situation this is. People are dying, and these deaths are preventable. I don't know about some of you, but I wouldn't want on my conscience the ability to change something right now, and yet I delay it out of for political reasons. So how do we deal with it short term? It's time to elect people who are bold enough, brave enough, courageous enough to do what is needed now, not to punt it to the next generation for that bravery, because people are dying right now. And their kids are going to suffer if we don't do something right now to change that situation. So I'm not looking for a long-term plan. I'm looking for a short-term plan. And that is, again, to remove those who disagree with that, because they are comfortable with the death and the immobility of Black and Brown people. And that is something that we should never be comfortable with.
Director Aquino.
Mr. Brown, you referred to yourself as a street level researcher, and it reminds me of an opportunity I had in our city of Folsom a couple months ago to walk around the city with a woman who is visually impaired and has to get around with a guide dog. And it was eye-opening, pun not intended, but that an uneven sidewalk or a low-hanging tree branch or an overgrown bush, something that I would consider a minor inconvenience, could potentially be very, very dangerous for her. If we want to be street level researchers and look for ways to create racial equity in transportation planning, is it just a matter of going to a certain neighborhood and walking and bicycling and seeing how difficult that is? Or are there certain things that we should be looking for as we try to be street level researchers?
Yeah, great question. Someone asked me to put together an institute of street level researchers. I'm working on it. And that answer is part of what I'm seeking to. That question is I'm seeking an answer to. When you consider the degree to which communities are segregated, that step that you just mentioned, going, walking, and biking, and meeting people elsewhere, let's not just mull over that. That's a huge step for many in the region. There are people in minority communities as well as outside of them who have never ventured to the other community to interact with people, especially outside of their cars. So I do think sort of immersing yourself in that environment will give you greater insights as to how dire the problem is and where there lies potential opportunities to change it. What I wouldn't want to happen is for that proximity to inequity, the privilege of proximity to inequity, to then be internalized as I now completely understand all that I need to understand. So in addition to getting an understanding, it also means you change internally in yourself, internally in your systems, which means a stronger effort around diversity, equity, and inclusion inside your organizations. I am at where I'm at in my career because I was given an opportunity internally to have the autonomy to do research that no one had done before. And so it's not about just hiring for the sake of diversity and tokenizing, but it's also important to hire to promote and to allow them to lead to change status quo. Because what we need is a change in status quo. And while the privilege and proximity will certainly lead to an internal knowledge that is needed to transform a system, it falls short of the lived experience. And thus, it is imperative that you bring in people with the lived experience to pass that baton to take it to the next level.
Thank you, Director Sander.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Brown, thank you for the presentation. I'm a scientist by training and always asking sort of cause and effect sort of questions as a result. And we as humans always seek answers to cause and effect type questions. We see something bad happens, we want to know what caused that. Unfortunately, we're not often very good at that because those are hard questions to answer, really difficult. And so, you know, as a policymaker here, I have struggled trying to figure out what is the root cause, is the phrase that's become more popular. What's the root cause of some of these problems? And so I like your diagram on public health. I have not seen that one, the more horizontally distributed effects. But what you see is a lot of prescriptions for help is just palliative, dealing with an effect downstream, and we could throw an awful lot of resources on a palliative sort of response and never get back to that root cause. So I would sort of like to hear some advice from you about how you find the roots and have the greatest effect for your effort. Otherwise, we can end up doing a lot of things that are just, you know, surface level, make us feel good, might look good from a certain angle, but have no effect in terms of the cause of the issues we see.
Yeah, so I think going back to that diagram and going back to the statement that I mentioned, and something of which has been a consistent topic or theme here, and that is we don't have to look far. We know what the root cause is. The root cause is structural racism. What that means then is we need a transformation of the structure to remove that racism so that people can flourish. We need that change in the system in terms of the processes, the procedures, and the distribution of resources. We need it in our transportation departments at the federal, state, regional, local levels, but we also need it in law enforcement. We also need to penalize behaviors that lead to what I would call the penalization of race-based 911 calls. Because when I talked about the self-deputization of white citizens, it is their historical connection to planning, policy, and policing that reinforces their behavior and their outlook on people unlike them. And so those bad apples, we know that they're bad apples. It's not the entire tree, need to be corrected. And so the root cause is structural racism. And many would argue classism. I would argue that classism results from structural racism, or at a minimum, there's a bidirectional relationship. So as you know, this is a multivariate exercise. There's not one answer, there are many answers, but one of the most profound answers is the fact that structural racism remains a problem and is one that we must address within every fabric of the regional planning, local planning, and countywide planning efforts throughout this country. So what's the response? So address structural racism. Sorry, Chair.
No, that's all right. I wanted you to finish the response. Thank you. Thank you. Have given us a lot of food for thought at regional planning as we look at projects in our community. What does that look like? How do we look at projects that we have more than enough projects in our community. But as we look at those in our processes in the future, we really do need to look at where areas have been underserved, where areas have not had the opportunities as others, and the whole issue of just transportation on bike lanes and walking, the statistics you gave are arresting as we think about people getting hurt walking or bike riding in their own communities. And what are the things that we can do in our jurisdictions to address making people safer on our roads? And it's not just about driving on our roads, which is important, absolutely, but the other modes and ways that people get to and from and around their communities, right? Walking and bike riding. How do we look at making sure that people have access to those vital pieces of infrastructure, regardless of where they live? So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I encourage you all. I think Charles took a little bit of different, added a few more slides from the REI working group. And that presentation is recorded as well. And I'll probably go back and watch this one again, Charles, because it really got me thinking. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the great.
If you don't mind, I would like to say a few.
Yes,
I want to thank you all for the invitation to be a part of this process. I want you all to know that it's not easy for me to talk about these issues, but in my career as a practitioner, as well as an academic, I kept running into the same issue. And that was that I started to notice that aggregate connection between policy planning and polity, which is why I came up with the concept of arrested mobility. Please use your power, your privilege, and your proximity to bring about change in the SACOG region. It's not just to benefit the individuals we deem underserved or disadvantaged, it's to the benefit of humanity. And so I ask for care during this time that you see your fellow human beings in a way that you know deserve immediate attention. It's not enough for us to be accepting of the fact that because it's politically difficult, it's something that we're going to wait to do. Let's do it now. So thank you, Chair Gore. Thank you everyone for having me here, and let's continue to work together.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Chair Gore, do you mind if I just say a couple of things to wrap up here? And Charles, thank you so much for coming and giving us your time as you did with our working group. You know, just in terms of, as you're listening to this, and as I said in my update, my written update to all of you yesterday, we as staff don't have all the answers at the moment. We are asking the questions. We're asking the questions about how we can move the needle on equity, inclusion, racial equity. One of the ways in which the board, I think, has put sort of some emphasis on this, shall we say, in the last funding round, the 4-county funding round, you put $3 million into what we call our Engage, Empower, Implement program. It's a small start. And that is something that's being stood up. You're going to hear about it as the board in the coming months. And the notion there is to really not assume that we have the answers as planners, as transportation practitioners, but to truly do the best kind of engagement that we can with a lot of our low-income communities and communities of color. We will not do that as SACOG. I want to give you my word for that. We will work with you as the local jurisdictions, but importantly too, I think what we see is a real need for a lot of our smaller community-based organizations to really do some, shall we say, kind of street level engagement. So it's not that we have the answers, we have the questions, and we want to try to stand up this program, EEI, you'll hear about it in the coming months in order to do that. And as I also said in my update yesterday, we already are, but we're going to be increasingly asked as we go for transportation funding, competitive grants, the state level and the federal level. What's your involvement with disadvantaged communities and communities of color? How have they been engaged in shaping this project? What's your approach been to equity and racial equity? And I want us as a region
to have a genuine answer, to be able to fill that out. Again, not that we will have the answers the next 6 to 12 months, but that we are acknowledging that there are serious racial inequities and structural inequities, and that we are trying to do something about it. So I just want to close this session of the workshop, trying to tie it back to a little bit of what's in front of you over the next 6 to 12 months.
Thank you, James. Appreciate that. All right. Yeah, none of us have the answers, but we're here to work together. And that's the value of this organization and our partnerships regionally. Let's move on to reports. So I did my report out, one quick report out as far as the nominating committee, and that'll be coming up meeting soon. Just a follow up on postponing the retreat that we were hoping to have on October 1st. That was a tough decision, but really for me, it was 2 reasons. One is we had a number of directors who couldn't be there. And then add on to it, there were concerns from a number of folks about the concern of meeting together. And with more than a third of our board not being able to attend, it felt like, you know, one of the biggest goals for me was to make sure we actually had time to connect. And we have 12 new board members. And I really wanted us to have that time together, and not having a third of all of us there, to me, it felt like we weren't going to be able to even meet that portion of the goal of the retreat. So we will have it. It might be that Vice Chair Jennings is chair at that time, but I'm still going to make a push to have the event in Roseville at the grounds, since there's lots of space there and it's a beautiful location that you all should come see. And with that, I am going to move that over to any other board member reports. Does anybody have a report? Any of our directors that you'd like to share something? Might see hands, and then James, is there anything else that you would like to report on?
Hey, Director Gallardo, maybe had her.
Oh, Julie.
Just a quick one.
Go ahead.
Ridiculously proud that Money Magazine named Rockland one of the top 50 places to live in the U.S. yesterday, one of the 2 cities in California. So I'm having a proud Rockland moment. Thank you for letting me share.
That's allowed. Thank you for sharing, and Director Soon.
Oh, no, I was just applauding Director Gallardo's achievement in Rockland. Thank you.
That's great. And I think Rich Lozano is applauding as well. So great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time this morning. We've got some item we will dig into at our next board meeting in October, which is October 21st. And of course, we'll have committee meetings before then. The rest of the items are receive and file. And if there is nothing else remaining, we will.
All right, Chair Gore, I was acknowledging Director Gallardo, but I wanted to say a couple of things just to wrap up.
Oh, gosh, James, go ahead.
Just a few quick things. So we are good news. Again, if you read the update from me yesterday, in addition to the $34 million for Green Means Go, our delegation led by Senator Pan secured an extra $4 million. So we're now up to $38 million for the Green Means Go program. Again, that's something else that you'll be hearing about in the months ahead in terms of standing up that program. But I again want to thank each and every one of you over the last 3 years who spent time on this. I know we had goose eggs our first 2 times out, and we prevailed. And I'll tell you why I believe we were able to get some funding for this. It's because we did our homework. And as a region in the state capital, we simply have to work harder. When we went and advocated for this funding the first time out, the question was, well, why your region? What would you do with this? What's the problem you're trying to solve? And if we gave local governments this kind of funding, show us that you actually have projects and you've got your act together. And we've done so much work with you and your staffs in particular. You've adopted resolutions supporting Green Means Go. We've got 23 green zones, jurisdictions with multiple green zones across the region. And it really was because we had our argument down, we had done our homework, we could show exactly what projects would move, how many jobs they would create, how many housing units it would spark. We did all of that across the 6 counties, and we got that funding. So an extra 4 million is the cherry on top, and we're really thankful for all of you, but also our delegation coming together across the aisle to make that happen. There was going to be an item on today's board meeting agenda for Next Generation Transit, as the Transportation Committee knows. That was sometimes we call them robust discussions. That was a robust discussion on the future of public transit in the region. And we have decided as a staff to hold that over to digest some of those comments that the Transportation Committee will come back. That the committee did pass that item, but we're going to come back to the committee as an info item. And I think there's a lot of things in that report, that strategy document that you will see in October that I think we could do a better job of teasing out and communicating and emphasizing. So we'll do that. And likely your board workshop in October will actually be just focused on this, because the future of public transit in this region is a critical topic and one we've been working on for some time. And then lastly, just in terms of other opportunities, we didn't have a board lunch this last month in between the Transportation and the Lunar Committee. I'm delighted to say that we've got our partners from the Regional Water Authority, RWA, coming at the lunch between the October 7th Transportation Committee and Lunar Committees to talk about the drought, to talk about the water projects, funding at the state level, but also the funding in the federal infrastructure bill sitting in the House right now, and also their involvement in Green Means Go, because as you all know, to get the infrastructure upgraded, we're going to need a lot of water sewer improvements. And a lot of times those are the special districts and the water districts, sometimes under RWA. And I know some of you have other districts. There's many of them. But anyway, more info to come. Please join us for that lunch on the drought and water projects and Green Means Go. So that concludes my report. Thanks very much.
James. And we've got a couple of other comments. First, Director Frericks, and then Director Saragosa.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. I just really want to stress the item of this sort of precedent with the delegation from the Sacramento region and the legislative delegation. No one knows for sure prior to 30 years ago, but over the course of the past 30 years, we at least have that far back of knowledge. There has never once before this particular ask been an occasion where the Sacramento region delegation, legislative delegation, very, very bipartisan delegation, all signed on to and advocated for the same priority in front of the legislature. And it's taken us 3 years to get there, to see some success from it. But, as we've talked about, I just want to really make that point because especially since we have so many new members of the board, it's a precedent setting item, and we should not be the last time we do it, of course. But I mean, there is absolutely this opportunity to have the roughly 13-member Sacramento area delegation come together on items that are of benefit to the entire region. And so I just thanks to everybody who has continued to work on this issue. And let's make sure we do it again.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks for reminding us it has been a long haul, but definitely something that we as an organization can be proud of as we work together on it. Michael.
Yeah, Lucas kind of took some of what I was going to say and said it very well. It was not an easy way to get to this point. I really want to thank the board for sticking with the advocacy efforts, for having a state lobbyist as well as a federal lobbyist now. I think it was, just great timing for us. I think we're well situated on the federal level now as well. We have some great lobbyists now back in DC too. And, it is what it is in terms of, you need to have that advocacy at the building in order to compete with Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. And so it's a real good testament, I think, to this board and to the collective efforts of everybody here. And then I wanted to just give a shout out to our colleagues, Mr. Jennings and Mr. Chenier, with the League of Cities being in Sacramento next week. I think this is going to be the first event at the new convention center. And so really looking forward to maybe seeing some of you there that are going. So hopefully we can see some of us in person, even if we're not going to be able to get together in October for our board meeting. And I'm also looking forward to seeing the new theater as well, as we'll be seeing a show on Thursday at a matinee. So for Hamilton. So looking forward to that.
That's great. Thank you. All right, everyone. Nice to see your faces. Thank you for engaging today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next board meeting in October. And with that, we are adjourned.